we have a chance, you and I, not necessarily like the heart, so we have a chance to truly leave legacies behind us. And I want us to talk through that a little bit today. We've spent a few weeks talking through these bigger questions that we need to nail down. So I've just called it Nail It Down. Who is the final authority in my life? Is God's word actually God's word? If so, can I trust it enough to allow that to be my guide as I try to live out this understanding that I've been created by him and for him and through him? And then we find our purpose there and we know why we exist according to his word. And if that's the case, then we want to try to follow that the best we can. And all of those are really cool action steps, but they build on each other. You start with something that's basic and fundamental so that you can build a life that is strong and is unshakable. But when we're building along the way, it's good to at least have a picture of what it's supposed to look like when we get to the end. Every Christmas, my wife has a jigsaw puzzle that someone will give her that she'll tackle, and we have the card table that sits out for 2 months in our house around in front of the television while we watch the games, and she's working on the puzzle. And a pivotal part of that process, as she tells me, I don't participate, but part of the process, so I'm told, is being able to have the picture on that box sitting in front of her at all times so that she can at least look up and have a guide. I have no doubt that she could put together a jigsaw puzzle without even looking at the picture, but I don't think it would be nearly as fun, and I think it would definitely take a little bit longer. She's committed to it, she does it, but that picture is absolutely critical. It's vital for her. And if you and I are going to build these kinds of lives that we're hoping we build, lives that ultimately fulfill our created purpose to reflect and to relate to God and to rule for him, then it's nice to be able to have a picture to look at to say, that's how it should look, that's how it could look, and I believe that's how it will look. And many of you were given that kind of picture. It was passed down to you like a mantle, and you have this now in your life, and you can look at it and say, this is what it looks like to have a heart that is full of commitment and faithfulness and patience and perseverance in this journey that we're on. Some of you did not, and don't feel bad. Most people did not. Most did not have that passed down to them. And for thousands of years, God's people, when they would want to look ahead and just to basically see, how is this supposed to look like if I'm doing it right? They had stories that they would tell and retell, stories that were passed down from generation to generation, and they would look back on these stories and say, that's what it's supposed to look like. Because not all of them had it in their home, or not all of them had it in a close friend, or not all of them had it in their church experience, but they had these stories. And a summary of many of those stories is found in Hebrews chapter 11. It's a relatively well-known, if you're into the Bible, a well-known chapter, and it lists different people who have gone on before and have allowed their stories to, in a way, be the picture on the box. The picture we can look at to say, this is what it's supposed to look like. And in Hebrews chapter 11, if you read through there, you're going to find names that you would expect to be there. Names like Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And you might not know all of those stories, but those names are not that unfamiliar to you. There's Enoch, who we don't really pay much attention to, but his story was that he went for a walk with God one day and just never came home. He just went and kept walking. 365-year-old man, which is probably time to take one of those walks. But he's been living a long time, and he's walking with God, and he just never comes back. It's a wild story. Like, well, of course he's going to be there. Of course there's going to be Moses there. I get that, and I understand these people and why they belong there. But we're not just given a list of people who did something heroic or even dramatic. Because we find in verse 35, the writer closes out this chapter, and he says, there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. So these men and women went through it. And we're not hearing their stories just because it was dramatic and memorable. I mean, if you're sawed in two, I hope that you get your story told. Like that's a lot. These people who gave up everything, but they're here because they weren't trying to be famous. They were just determined to be faithful. And as a result, we have their picture here. And this chapter ends reminding us there are so many names of which we're never going to be able to truly know, but that left those kinds of memories. And even more so, those kinds of legacies. And the chapter ended really the way it began, because in verse 1 and 2, he set the tone for the whole chapter. He said, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. Meaning these people I'm about to list, all these ancient people, the reason they are listed is because they were living for something more than what they and everyone else could see and hear and feel. They were living their lives for something more. They believed with every ounce of their being that they could put 100% confidence in what was coming and what God had prepared and what was awaiting them and what God was going to ultimately do for them, and it wasn't in what is here now. And as a result, we're talking about them thousands of years later. So the question I want us to wrestle with today and think through it is, what kind of legacy am I leaving? You say, well, I don't care about that. I don't really care if I'm remembered at all. It's not about being remembered. It's about living a life that makes a difference even after we're gone. That's a legacy. Not just they remembered my name and they read my name or they remembered even one specific part of my story. It is my life continues to make a difference even long after I am gone. That is a legacy. So what kind of legacy are you leaving? And as we think through that question, maybe we can ask some smaller questions, because we might feel like we're leaving the kind of legacy we want to live, but these legacies that we're looking at that are still making a difference thousands of years later, giving us a picture of what it's supposed to look like, these legacies were built on something different, on a belief, on a trust, on action based on something more being there. So a few questions to ask ourselves. One, am I living right now like there is more than me? Like there's more than this? Because for most of us, and I'll just say it myself, just to keep it from feeling like I'm stepping on a toe. I know for me, I will say, well, today has been a good day because I feel kind of good about it. Or I'll say today was a terrible day because things didn't work out how I wanted them to work out. But if I am the kind of person that is going to leave a real legacy, I have to at times step back and realize there is something more than me that is important right now. How I perceive today is not the ultimate measuring stick on whether today was a good day or not, because there is so much more happening, and God sees so much more of the story. And I am an important part, I'm a valuable part because God says I am, but I am not the crucial, critical part of existence. And there is more than just me. And when we live our lives, everything based on how I feel, am I going to do this or not? I don't know. What do I feel like doing? Is this something that I want to be a part of? I don't know. How is it going to affect me? Are you going to show up for this? I don't know. How long of my time am I going to have to invest? How much of my energy am I going to? Everything being around me. And ultimately, that is not the way to leave a legacy. That builds something here, and I can look at it day by day and think, oh, I accomplished something. Or even someone else may notice, wow, you did a great job there, but then it just is gone. There's nothing more than that. So am I living my life as if there is more than me? Another small question here, am I living my life like there is more than this existence, this life I have right here, right now? When you go through the story of God, you run into a man named Solomon, and Solomon is credited for writing most of Ecclesiastes. And when you read through the book of Ecclesiastes, you find over and over again this word meaningless. This is the wisest man that ever lived, and he talked about how life was meaningless. And he was absolutely wrong, but that was his perspective. Life was not meaningless. It's just if you live a life that is completely focused on the right here, the right now, what you realize is everything you built up will be torn down. Everything you accomplish will be taken away. Everything you grow is ultimately going to die. And he looked back and said, what's the point? Well, there is no point if this is all there is. But there is so much more. And that's why at the end of his life, he looked back and said, just fear God and do what he asks you to do, because everything else is ultimately going to be stripped away from you. Life is not meaningless. It's just if this is all there is, it is really meaningless. If I found out that this was all there was, I am done being, not even good, I'm done being moral. I'm tired. It's too hard. I don't care anymore. I'm moving on. You say, well, you live a better life if you, how do you know? I don't know. Let's just move on and forget the whole thing, but I'm not going to forget the whole thing because I know this is just a small part of it. And how I live it out is ultimately going to affect the bigger part of it on what happens after this is all gone. So am I living in a way that says there's more than this? The third little question here, am I living in a way that says there's more for me? There's something else. When you read through Hebrews chapter 11, there are some names, again, that you're going to recognize even if you're new to the Bible. But what you'll find that is so common for so many of them is that each of them, before there was that big moment that allowed them to be remembered in this way, there was a moment where God had to actually go to them and call them out. And one by one, in their own way, they said, why me? Are you kidding? I'm not the right guy for this. I don't have any influence. I don't have the size. I don't have the strength. I don't have the wisdom. I don't have the pedigree. I am not the right guy, over and over. I'm not the right girl, over and over. And it was as if God said, that's exactly why you're the one I'm calling out here. But they had to be willing to get to a point of saying, I'm going to live like there's more of me. There's more that God's calling out. In other words, they weren't afraid to be great. They weren't afraid to say, okay, God, do you realize who you're calling? Do you realize where I've been? Do you realize what I have not done or what I have done? And they were willing to rise to the challenge. And many of you don't feel like the kind of people that God's going to change the world with, and that's exactly why you are the perfect ones, and that's why God will use you. And that's why God will call you out. But you've got to be willing to say, God, even if I fall flat on my face, I'm willing to give this a shot because you're believing in me. My whole life is about me finding a way to believe in you, and you're telling me right now, in this moment, you believe in me, you're calling me out. There's more for me. And then lastly, am I living like there is more of me? So am I living like this is all, like there's more than me? Am I living like there is more than this and there's more for me? And then lastly, am I living like there is more of me? In other words, I've still got more to give. I can still do this. I found this in my own life in so many different spots. There are times when you trust me and you say, would you please pray with me about this? And you're not meaning tomorrow when you get in your truck and you're driving to the office, would you throw up a prayer? That's not what you mean. You're meaning, will you get down on your knees and care about this the way I care about this and fight for me? And several years ago, I really understood, I felt like for the first time, what was being asked. And I had to look in the mirror and say, you can do more. You can do more than this. You can give more of your time and energy. And it was that moment where I began to prioritize that part of my life. I look back at other areas like generosity. When I was 7 years old, my dad started giving me an allowance, and it was $1. And he would always give me $1, but he would give it to me in dimes to make it really easy because there was no ATM to go to church and drop one in. And as a kid, that was just something I understood. And as I got older, I had to flip it a little bit because I was getting stingy with my money. And I started saying, God, I'm a teenager and I'm mowing yards and you're allowing me to keep 90% of this? God, that's huge. I can't believe you would trust me with this much. But as the years have gone on, I remember looking back and going, man, if I spent 20 years living off 90, I can do better. And I thought, I can live off 89%, God. We're going to try this. And then we're going to scale it back. And we're going to try for 88, and we're going to see. And moving on as different seasons hit. And God has been faithful every time. So whether it's time, whether it's generosity, whether it's money, whether it's just trying to work on what little gifts and abilities that I have, there's more of me to give, and I can give more. And I look back at these men and women of God, and that's how they lived their lives. It was all about more. There's more than this life. There's more than me. There's more that matters, and I'm going to pour everything I have into the more. And as a result, God creates this legacy through their lives. One of my favorite legacy moments in God's story is told in 2 Kings. Elijah was a prophet, a man of God that did some incredible stuff, and even if his heart wasn't in it, there was so much drama around him that his story is worth remembering. But that's not why he's remembered. But he got to the end of his life, and God revealed to Elijah that his time was coming to an end. Selfishly, I've always hoped that God would give me a little indicator that, like, my time's winding up. I have a little bit of the flair for the dramatic, and I have some ideas about how I want to go out. So I'd like to know, because I got some things that I want to line up. But he probably won't let me know. But Elijah knew, and his successor, who would become his successor, Elisha, he knew as well. So we have this moment in 2 Kings chapter 2 when Elijah and Elisha, the mentor and the protege, are having one last walk together. And as they're walking along this path and talking and realizing this is it for them, they come to a little body of water. We don't know how much water was there, but they get to a point where they're going to have to wade through or have a moment. Elijah chose the moment. In 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 8, it says, Elijah took his cloak, that outer thing he was wearing, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, tell me what I can do for you before I'm taken from you. Any last requests, any last blessings or favors? And Elisha's reply was, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. The one that knew Elijah the most still said, if I could have anything, I want what you have. I want that bit of a relationship. Whatever you have with God, that's what I want. I want a double portion of that. And oftentimes, people from a distance may want a gift that someone else has or want an experience someone else has. But then when you get to know the person, it's that whole don't get to know your heroes thing. And Elisha is so close to Elijah, and he's the one that watched it all. And Elijah said, what can I do for you? What's your one request? He says, I want exactly what you have. I want your legacy. I want to carry that on. I want that mantle. Give it to me. Let me carry it on. It's worth it, and I want that. Elijah's response to him was, you've asked a difficult thing, Elijah said. Yet, if you see me when I'm taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not. As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. And Elisha saw him no more. So they're walking along. You know, Enoch had his moment where he just takes the walk with God and keeps going. Now Elijah has this moment where God actually sends what looked to Elisha to be a chariot of fire and horses of fire. They come down, they take him away, and Elisha sees it all. And then the question for him was still, okay, but did I get the blessing? Did I get the gift? Is the legacy still alive with me? And it says when Elijah was taken up, his cloak was left behind. And so he reaches down and he grabs the cloak and he's ready to try it for himself. And verse 13 says, when he picked up the cloak that had fallen from him and went back and stood at the bank of the Jordan, he took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and struck the water with it. Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah? He asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. Now, it says crossed. I think he strutted over. I think that is a moment. He picked up that cloak, wound that thing up, slapped that water, it parted across, and there's a new prophet in town. Here we go. The legacy lives on. That probably would be a bit arrogant, so he probably did not do that. But he realized in that moment, like, the legacy is moving on. Elijah's gone. Maybe they'll remember his name, maybe they won't, but what he had will continue to speak long after he's gone. And that's the legacy. That's what is so important and vital here. Leaving a legacy is not about being remembered. Leaving a legacy is about continuing to make a difference even long after you're gone. We bring it back to that Hebrews chapter 11 that we started with today. The actual first person that is mentioned as having a legacy worth remembering was not Moses. It wasn't Abraham. It wasn't even Enoch. It was Abel. The first death the world ever saw. There's Adam and Eve, and then they had the kids Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. Story's over for him. Not necessarily. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, the very first person's mentioned. He says, by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. Now that is a legacy. The first dead man on earth, and he is still speaking today. Not because he wanted to be famous. He just desired to be faithful, and it cost him his life. And yet he still speaks to us today, and his legacy still lives as a reminder of how God treats the offerings that we choose to bring and we choose not to bring to him. That's a legacy. This week, I was informed throughout the week that there was a young, older lady in our community that passed away. Her name was Ruth Maynard, and I, a little bit, have an acquaintance relationship with her. I first met her actually here on this plot of land. I met her because I wanted to meet the lady who was willing to sell the property so that we could tear down her home and build a place of worship. And I met her there in that moment. She was walking towards me, 80 years old, and she said, can I take some of those bricks there in our house before you take them off? I just want to remember one for every child. And of course, I stepped back and introduced myself and felt really, really small in that moment and just said, have all the time you want. She gathered up a few bricks because her husband had built the house, and she carried the bricks back to her little truck, and they drove off. 5 years later, she showed up for 5 years ago, a year later, she sat here in the front row for our very first service. And she's a little old lady with a whole lot of hair, and she got a Pentecostal background, and she was just raising her hands and singing. I thought, you are more alive right now than anybody else that's in this room. But we talked a little bit afterwards, and she said, you don't know how many prayers I prayed by the bedside of each of my children, praying that this would be a holy space where they would grow up and know the Lord. What I didn't know is that my prayer would be answered 1,000-fold, as I know will be thousands of people who will come to know Jesus on this land that I prayed over. She had so many different opportunities to sell it to different businesses, but when she found out that there was someone interested in building a house of worship on her home, that's what sealed the deal for her. And Mrs. Ruth's legacy is going to live forever. And every time one of you says yes to Jesus right here in this place, it is in part an answer to a prayer that she prayed for years and years and years on this ground. And she prayed that God would allow it to achieve something bigger than her. And we're not all going to be able to sell our homes and have people build churches on them. And I understand that. We get it. But each of us has a chance to leave something that's bigger than us, that continues to speak long after we're gone. But we don't wait until the end to make that decision. We decide now that my life now is going to reflect the goodness of God. And my decisions are going to reflect his character. And even if they forget my name, they will never outlive my legacy.